All right, week 10 is upon us, and we are talking trends for fantasy, the most added players. Some week 10 roster trends. Keaton Mitchell in week 9, 9 carries for 138 yards and a TD. So should we stash him? Is that the right move when it comes to quarterbacks? Josh Dobbs. He's coming in at number 2, right behind Mitchell. The dude is a rocket scientist in his free time, Dave, but he's coming in and playing hero for the Vikings, doesn't even know his teammates' names, leads them to a comeback win because Jaron Hall was injured, so he is there at number 2. Number 3, Jason Myers. I feel like he might be my kicker at this point. I don't know.
Well, it looks like he's somebody's kicker in everybody's fantasy league.
And we have Dave Richard and Heath Cummings. We're going down the list. Week 10 roster trends, guys. We're going to start with the running backs. Heath, we saw Keaton Mitchell there right at number 1 on a lot of people's rosters. Is he someone that's catching your eye for week 10?
Absolutely. Well, he's a must-add player for Week 10, not quite a must-start player. Listen, I love the fact that we're combining a player like Mitchell, who averaged 6.9 yards per touch in college, a hyper-efficient back, and putting him next to Lamar Jackson, who makes basically every running back he plays with into a hyper-efficient back. This guy had Mark Ingram at the end of his career averaging 5 yards per carry. Gus Edwards always averages 5 yards per carry. I'm sure Keaton Mitchell's going to average 5 yards per carry. He might average 6. What we don't know yet is where he fits. I'm going to put him on a scale. There's a scale between Jaleel McLaughlin and Devon Achane, and he's somewhere on that scale. He might be Devon Achane. He might be Jaleel McLaughlin. We need to roster him. We need to find out. I'd expect probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 touches this week.
I agree, and I've seen the Ravens take on some tough opponents lately, and they've smashed them with the run. So there's an opportunity for him to be that hyper-efficient running back without him necessarily getting a ton of work. Don't have him ranked as a top 24 running back or anything like that quite yet. But I do think that he's got some opportunities. You could do worse as a bye-week replacement at running back. And so now the question is asked to me all the time, who's next? Because I think we were ahead of the curve on Keaton Mitchell. If you listen to our podcast, I might have said a few things about him a month or so ago. So who's next? I think Ty Chandler in Minnesota could be the next man up. Remember, the Vikings traded for Cam Akers. They thought Cam Akers would eventually take over for Alexander Madison. Now Akers is on the shelf for the rest of the year. He had an up-and-down preseason, Jacqueline. In the first game of the preseason, he looked like he would be that guy for the Minnesota Vikings. Kind of tailed off after that. But he's going to have some opportunities as the number 2 running back for the Vikings moving forward. And I can't help myself. If I have a roster spot open, I'm going to grab Ty Chandler. I'm going to carry him for a couple of weeks. And I'm going to hope that his efficiency rises because Alexander Madison has been one of the least efficient running backs in the National Football League. The other thing to keep in mind here is that the Vikings now have a mobile quarterback. And Josh Dobbs might take off and might lead this team in rushing the rest of the season. So whatever upside Ty Chandler has could be negated by what Josh Dobbs does as a runner. Nonetheless, he's someone that if you want to stash a running back, that's the guy to go and stash.
Dave, you mentioned the Vikings and their now mobile quarterback in Josh Dobbs. We were talking about him at the top of this segment. And Heath, he is someone who is a must-add. Is he a must-start at this point? I mean, I guess if your QB is on a bye, like you could definitely pick up Josh Dobbs, and that's a good option.
Yeah, I wouldn't call him a must start, but he is certainly a plausible start, which is more than we ever thought that Joshua Dobbs was going to be. What he's doing with his legs is really so valuable. You can be a guy who averages 6 yards per attempt, and if you average 50 rushing yards per game, you're still going to be a good fantasy quarterback. The added bonus now, of course, is that he's got Jordan Addison, he's got TJ Hawkinson, and very soon, if not this week, he's going to have Justin Jefferson. He's got a great play caller. I could absolutely see Dobbs the rest of this season being a top 12, top 15 quarterback. Already has 4 games this season with 24 fantasy points or more. That's tied for the 3rd most in the NFL.
Just remember, last week, he did what he did in 3 quarters of play with a backup left tackle and no Justin Jefferson on the field.
Yep.
There is a lot to be excited about with Josh Dobbs rest of season. But Baker Mayfield's kind of been coming into his own. It's about time that Baker Mayfield started paying off for fantasy managers, but landing in Tampa Bay just seems to be exactly what he needed. We're talking about a quarterback in an offense that can't run the football, so Mayfield's got to throw it a lot, and the running back is actually a great option for him out of the backfield. You know about the stud wide receivers they have. You'll hear a little bit more about Cade Otton, their tight end, in just a little bit. How about this, Jacqueline? At least 18 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games, at least 23 fantasy points in 3 of those 4. I think Baker Mayfield is one of those safe floor fantasy quarterbacks where you start him and you say, okay, he's not going to lose me this week. He might actually help me win me my week. So I like him better this week than Dobbs. Rest of the season, I'll take Dobbs. But for this week, I think Baker Mayfield's the one that you want to go with, simply because the matchup against Tennessee, yeah, we've seen the Titans, their defense has played well. They haven't taken on a lot of tough quarterbacks. I don't want to say that Baker Mayfield is a tough quarterback or a great quarterback, but he's throwing enough, he's been efficient enough, he gets the job done, so I don't mind him as a top 12 option this week.
Yeah, he's a gamer. As our co-worker Pete Prisco likes to say, he's got that fire in the belly. He like puts his body on the line, so I guess that works out.
We thought that fire was out for a while, but it's been reignited in Tampa Bay.
All right, guys, let's move on to wide receivers. Heath, who are you rostering in Week 10 when it comes to the wideouts?
It's a guy that we talked about last week, and he got up to about 40-45% roster rate. It's going to keep rising. He should be rostered in almost 80% of leagues. It's Demario Douglas, my guess as the #1 wide receiver for the New England Patriots rest of season. The 10.5 fantasy points last week, a little bit disappointing, but the expectation that we should have for rookie wide receivers, especially guys that don't pop off immediately, is that they will get better in the second half of the season. Got a little extra motivation this week with the College Football Playoff Committee not ranking his Liberty Flames yet like they should.
Yes, that will be what motivates them. Watching him play, Jacqueline, has been an absolute joy. Demario Douglas, super fast, really quick off the snap, definitely has upside to be a PPR starter in 3 receiver leagues. That's about where I have him ranked this week. Wouldn't want to overvalue him and call him like a top 24 wide receiver rest of season, but he's got great potential in PPR. I also think Khalil Shakir has great potential in PPR. We've now seen 2 straight games where the Bills aren't chucking it downfield nearly as much as they were earlier in the season. They've also been playing in 3 receiver sets, and Shakir actually had a target share that was nearly double that of Gabe Davis. Is it possible that he's taking over as the #2 wide receiver? I didn't say #2 option in the offense, but the #2 wide receiver in the Buffalo Bills offense, at least 9.7 PPR points each of his past 2 games, and he can line up anywhere. This is a wide receiver that I wouldn't be excited to start this week, but as a bye week replacement, I would. I do think he is bench worthy, so he might be the next Demario Douglas, so to speak.
Bench worthy. I like that, that phrase.
Yeah, I'd rather have Keaton Mitchell and then Khalil Shakir and then Ty Chandler as far as like ranking the bench worthy guys.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. I feel like it's a tough, a tough go when you're looking at your bench and who's bench worthy or not. It's like a fine line.
Well, anybody that's on your bench who isn't bench worthy, they don't belong on the bench, if you know what I mean.
Okay, let's talk about tight ends. I always have trouble with tight ends. I feel like personally it's a tricky position when you're dealing with fantasy, especially I had Sam Laporta on a bye last week, so I felt like scraping the waiver wire. But for Week 10, Heath, who are you targeting when it comes to the tight ends?
Well, I wish Arthur Smith thought Jonnu Smith was bench worthy, but he doesn't. In fact, I think he thinks that he's better than Kyle Pitts. Jonnu Smith has scored more fantasy points than Pitts this year. He has more catches. He has more yards. He has more touchdowns. And yet we still keep ranking Kyle Pitts as a top 12 tight end and viewing Jonnu Smith as a #2. He is the best waiver wire ad at the position this week. I don't like this. I wish it wasn't true, but both Pitts and Smith borderline #1 tight ends rest of the way.
And it's weird because Jonnu Smith, it looked like, was getting phased out of the Falcons offense, and then last week he played a lot more, and then he made a big play. Can't help but like him as a top 15 tight end rest of season. And so now this is for people like you, Jacqueline, who are struggling to find a tight end that you can reliably start for week to week. And you're ready to go.
Yes,
you're done with Kyle Pitts. I can't sit here with a straight face, look you in the eye and say, Cade Otton is the solution to all of your tight end problems, but I can tell you that he's bench worthy. At least 6 targets in 3 straight games. The Bucs are finding other alternatives to throw the football to besides Evans and Godwin, and he's had at least 4 catches in each of those past 3 games, and last week 2 touchdowns. That's going to get a lot of fantasy managers' opinion, or not opinions, obviously they're going to have a good opinion of him. It's going to get their attention as well. I wonder if he can keep going. I'm not super excited about it, but I think Otton could end up being a tight end who could be in and out of fantasy lineups moving forward. Not quite as good as Jonnu Smith, not quite as good as Logan Thomas, and maybe not quite as good as Luke Musgrave in Green Bay, but that's where I'd rank him, right in that range with Luke Musgrave and other low-end tight ends, Hunter Henry. I'd rather start Otton than Henry this week, just to give you an example, but I think that he's someone that could be a decent 3rd option for the Bucs, and therefore a decent fantasy option as well.
So if I have Kyle Pitts or Kyle Pitts fantasy managers, would you start Otton over Kyle Pitts?
I'm not ranking it that way this week, so
Okay.
I'm not ready to go there. Part of it is because the Falcons are taking on the Cardinals. That's
Right.
a really good matchup. I'd like to think that Pitts can get going in that matchup, but I mean, Heath's been saying, we expect Kyle Pitts to get going for 3 years now, and it hasn't really happened yet. So I don't know what it'll take, but the matchup at least is favorable for Pitts.
It hurts my soul. And the minute I send him to the bench is the minute that he is going to have an amazing week, because that's just how it always works.
Would you take one for the rest of the fantasy world and bench him so everyone else knows to start Kyle Pitts? Could you do that?
That's
for
a
us?
lot of responsibility on me, but I could be convinced. So maybe we'll have a conversation about it. And, you know, I don't know. Maybe I'm willing to take one for the team for Kyle Pitts. I'll have to think.
If that's how it'll work out, then we would thank you for it.
Perfect. Dave Richard, Heath Cummings, we thank you guys for joining us here on HQ talking about Week 10 roster trends. You can hear the crew on the Fantasy Football Today podcast. Download and listen wherever you get your pods, or make it easy, scan that QR code on your screen.